I'm Sarah Krom, Managing Partner of SKC & Co. CPAs, and welcome to our office hours this month. We are very excited about today's topic. We took a month off and kind of did a little recorded version of office hours for you. So we are very happy to be back live with two really awesome guests on a very important topic today. A little housekeeping issues, as we always start with. This is being recorded. So if you don't wish to be on video, please take yourself off video. If you want to refer to this later, you're welcome to do that. This will be on our website. You're also free to share the link with anybody who missed this presentation, but you think would benefit from it. So as always, with all office hours, we encourage active participation. This is for you to get the most benefit out of. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Our wonderful marketing director, Karen Donaway, will be monitoring that chat so that we can continue on with the presentation, but work in your questions as they become relevant. So please do so and make this as valuable as it can be for you. We also have sprinkled some poll questions in sort of to get a pulse of the audience. So we will make sure that you guys are still with us and awake with some poll questions throughout the day. So with that, we have 96 million Americans who are currently vaccinated, and business owners are asking themselves, now what? What comes next? So this question, although it seems very simple, opens Pandora's box. There are HR issues, there are legal issues, and so today we have two really great guests to help us sift through both types of issues today. So I'd like to welcome Jen Lestrange to answer the HR side of things. And then we also have Damien Weinstein here to help represent the legal side. So Jen and Damien, if you guys could just give a quick introduction of yourselves, and then we can jump into the presentation.
Sure. Damien, you want to start or should I?
Go ahead, Jen.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And thanks so much for inviting me to join the panel. I think it's certainly a relevant topic. I am the managing director of Red Clover. We are a consulting firm that specializes in strategic human resources and organizational change management. And needless to say, the last 18 months or so has offered a lot of opportunity for change. And I'm just really happy to be here today.
Awesome. And good morning, everyone. And thank you to SKC for inviting me for today. So my name is Damien Weinstein. I'm a founding partner at Weinstein Klein. We're a law firm in New York, New Jersey that works primarily with entrepreneurs and small business owners on their day-to-day employment law matters. So as you can imagine, we're dealing a lot with COVID compliance in the workplace, what it's like to have a remote workplace, what it's like to have a hybrid workplace, bringing employees back, the vaccine, disability accommodations, and everything in between. So I'm looking forward to today. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, welcome to both of you, and thanks so much for joining us today. I love that we have the people side of it and the legal side of it, risk management. It's going to be a great discussion today. So before we jump into the meat of the presentation, let's throw up a quick poll question just to take the pulse of the audience. So who on this morning's call has a work environment that is fully open, all in person, who is fully remote, and who is doing some sort of hybrid version, 2 days a week here, 3 days a week there type thing? Okay, so we'll give it a couple more seconds and then we will populate the responses so you can all see them. Go ahead, Brittany, you can probably finish it up. So not one person is fully open or in person, which is pretty interesting. We do have still 35% that are fully remote and then 65% who are hybrid in person. Awesome. So we'll see if we can get people to be fully open and all in person. And if that's not what you want to do, that's fine too, but we'll make sure you're compliant and doing all that you're supposed to if you want to go in that direction. So let's jump into bringing people back to the office and what that looks like. And Jen, I want to start with you. What do business owners need to do to be able to safely and appropriately bring employees back? I mean, from a procedure and policy standpoint, do we have guidance? Do we have template policies and procedures for this? I mean, where do we even begin to start?
So it's a great question. And we're working through a number of return to work protocols with different clients. The thing that I would encourage everyone to start with is first starting with what's appropriate, meaning what does the business need? So is your business such that you need to bring people back to the office? That's the first question. Then it's kind of cascading that same question down the organization and then to the individual positions. And what we're finding through this process is that even for businesses where they're saying, yes, we need to be in the office, maybe they don't need to be in the office full time. Maybe hybrid is an ongoing permanent solution for them that offers other business benefits like saving on office space or creating different ways of working, or maybe their whole business model has changed in the last 18 months. So the first thing is evaluating what does the business need? And then for individual positions where we start to get nuanced is you can have a position that might be required to be in the office 5 days a week. And this comes down to identifying what are the essential functions of that job. And some jobs you can do remotely and some jobs you just can't, depending on what they are. Then you'll have individual considerations where, for example, we were working through onboarding protocols for new hires, which has been something that in the last year has been completely different from any other way we've onboarded employees in the past. And now we're saying, all right, well, we have a job that maybe it can be remote 3 days a week. You only need to be in the office 2 days a week. But if you're new to the organization, we want to see you more often because we want to onboard you the right way. We want to teach you how we work here, its culture, values, as well as policies and procedures. So the first thing is the business side. From a safety perspective, once we've established what the business wants to do, the next thing around how do we bring people back into the office in a way that's safe? Because everything that we do around policies and procedures at its highest level, whether it's employee handbook or whether it's policy, is about how do we create a safe and effective environment for our employees. So it's everything from, do we need to change the layout of the office, right? If everyone was open space on top of each other in cubicles, probably not doing that coming back into the office. There's an office space consideration. There's how do people move through the office from a behaviors perspective and from a policy perspective. There's questions around, do we need to have in place some sort of software to either track attestation or, the whole temperature checks, the questionnaires that we've all gotten used to filling out over the last year. Do we continue to do that? And if someone does test positive, do we need to do contact tracing? And that's something that we're working through as well. From a behaviors perspective, it's educating people. And this is less about policy and more about communication, which is a huge component to this. It's talking to people about, okay, if you're going to work in the office, let's say we're going to a hot desk or a hoteling concept. What happens when you arrive in the office? Do you need to wipe down all the hard surfaces before you sit down? What happens when you go to the lunchroom? What happens when you go to, any kind of shared space? What is the new protocol and what is the procedure so that everyone's keeping the same level of hygiene and protocol and behavior and just keeping everyone and their colleagues safe at the same time. So it really depends on the business. It depends on how large they are, and it depends on, first and foremost, what they're trying to achieve with a return to office procedure.
So right into Pandora's box with question one.
Right.
As a business owner, when I hear you talk about giving people responsibilities and determining if positions are virtual, hybrid, in office, the first thing that comes to mind for me is discrimination. And again, the whole separate legal risk management issue around who does need to come back, who doesn't, and so on and so forth. And again, every business is going to be different. So, Damien, what's your legal perspective on policies? And I would hope most people have a handbook and policies and procedures. If we have any employees, do we have to start all over? Is everything out the window and we're really blank paper and pen at this point, or where do we go from here?
Fair question. All right. So no need to scrap the existing handbooks, but I do think, everything there need to be updates. We're in kind of a new world and our policies and our procedures need to reflect that. So if we have people still working remotely, whether it's part of the workforce or the entire workforce, we need policies and protocols that kind of define that working relationship and what the rules are of employees who are working remotely. If we're bringing people back, we need written policies about what that plan is. Sarah, you brought up a great point about discriminatory either effect or impact. Some people have different policies in place for who in the office can come back. Sometimes that's based on seniority. Sometimes that's based on the department that the people specifically are in. So long as there's legitimate business justifications, that's great. where some employers are finding themselves in trouble is where they bring back certain categories of the workplace that just happen to be all women or all men or people typically under this one age or whatever it might be. So it's important to kind of think through what those procedures actually look like, figure out a way to make sure that you're legally compliant, both procedurally, but also optically, and make sure that that's communicated in writing. Obviously, you want written policies and procedures about what safety measures are in place. Like Jen mentioned, that's going to be different for different companies. If there's a shared workspace, that's different. If there's a communal eating area, that's something that needs to be addressed. If everyone just kind of has their own separate offices, then maybe that's a little bit simpler or more straightforward, and we can address that. But the idea is to communicate to your employees what safety measures are in place, what the company is doing to keep them safe. Perhaps also importantly, who's responsible for overseeing those efforts. The CDC has a term that I absolutely hate. It's called the COVID ambassador, because I don't think anyone wants that title. But they're basically, it's the person who's designated in office to kind of oversee safety and health procedures and protocols. That could be one person, it could be a small team of people, but employees need to know who's kind of in charge. They need to know who they can address their concerns and complaints with, how they can address those. If there's a protocol or a procedure for them to raise their concerns or issues with the company, maybe they think the company's not doing enough to keep them safe. More importantly, make sure that the employees know that they can do that without fear of retaliation, that's welcomed within the workplace. And then more practical policies of just how the company will handle requests for accommodations, whether that's an employee who says, I need to stay remote full time, or I could do hybrid, or I need some sort of modified schedule because my student or my child is a student and has remote school or whatever it might be, half days. These are all questions that employers are getting. They're in the dark on most of the time. They do not need to be in the dark. They can have these policies in place that kind of help them address those questions, but also help their employees know that their company is taking this seriously and actually cares about their well-being. And all those things are best served in a written policy that's distributed to employees.
You guys are making a great case to stay virtual and not have to put all this in writing
selfishly
and figure it all out. I mean, I know as a business owner over the last, what are we on now, 14 months or so, it's often felt like we're flying blind, right? This is unprecedented times, but I mean, we'll get to who do we look to for guidance in a few minutes. And I think that's just been the biggest challenge for business owners is the CDC says one thing, which in my opinion is oftentimes very vague and generalized. Our state has oftentimes implemented stricter policies than what the CDC publishes as guidelines. And that's been a challenge, as a New Jersey business owner. So, the frustration for those of you on the call who are continuing to scratch your head, believe me, you're not alone. So let me ask the smoking gun, and I'll pose this to both you, Jen and Damien. Can employers require people to come back? Can we make it mandated and require everybody to come back in some capacity, even if not full time?
Jen, who's up first?
You want me to go first?
No, it doesn't matter to me.
The short answer to the question is yes. The longer answer is yes, and why? So, you can require, and we've seen businesses where they've said, yes, you have to come back. And it all comes back to what is the business? What is the essential function of the job? And is it a job for the business to be able to continue where that has to be done in office? And then as Damien mentioned earlier, if someone comes back and says, I'm not comfortable coming back into the office, I need to stay remote, this is why, then it becomes a request for an accommodation. And is that accommodation considered reasonable? And with that, I will let Damien continue.
So Damien, before you jump in, Damien, I just want to have a follow-up question to what Jen said. Do we as business owners, Jen, need to document the why? If we're going to mandate, let's say, everyone to come back for 2 days a week or whatever it might be, do we have the responsibility of documenting why we think that needs to happen as a business owner? Because it is going to be different for every business, right? We can do accounting remotely. Yeah. We certainly can't build machines in a factory remotely.
So it's not about you documenting somewhere why. I think it's really critically important to communicate to your employees why you're asking them to come back, and making sure that that is understood and that that is a shared belief among the employee population, because that becomes an engagement question for your employees. The requirement around documentation is around documenting from a job description point of view. If we're requiring someone to come back in, and let's say for the sake of argument, it's a position where you want them in the office 5 days a week, but you've got part of the workforce that is hybrid. And I'll use the archetypical example. You have a receptionist and you receive clients in your office and you need a receptionist there 5 days a week. That would be documented in the job description saying this position is required to be 100% on site. And that would be the documentation that would be used as the foundation for the discussion. If someone came back and said, well, listen, I'm not comfortable working in office. And then the employee needs to request an accommodation to be able to see if it is reasonable for them to either do that job differently or do something different for the organization.
Gotcha. Okay, Damien, you're up. What's your take on this?
I'll add to that slightly, but that was pretty good, Jen. You clearly have been hanging out with too many lawyers.
I hang out with Damien a lot.
Fair enough. So generally, yes, employees don't have some right to work remotely or work from home. Like all things, especially with employees, and like all things, especially if an attorney is speaking, the answer is it's never that simple, and it kind of depends, and it depends on a lot of different things. So as a general matter, yes, refusal to return, if somebody refuses to return to work, that can generally be grounds for termination or discipline. But the question is, Jen was talking about why requiring people to come back. I'll kind of flip it and say, one of the other questions is, why would an employee be refusing to return to work? So if the refusal is based on a protected basis, which the most obvious being some sort of underlying medical condition that the employee might have some medical documentation and a medical provider who's saying this person should not return to work for their own health and safety, they need to work remotely. Even that sometimes could be enough, it could not be enough. That, again, it depends, which I hate saying, but it really does. So that would be one basis for an employee a protected basis for an employee to refuse to return to work, or to at least object to returning to work. And then the employer needs to be careful and mindful about engaging in what Jen referred to as the interactive process. That's essentially a request for an accommodation. An employee says, I can't return to work, I have this underlying medical condition. It requires the employer to kind of get into a back and forth with that employee, which is an uncomfortable conversation, but this happens all the time across the country, and it's completely legitimate, is to ask kind of what not necessarily so much what the underlying medical condition is, but what the impact of that condition is that requires that person to work remotely. And to see, maybe that person can come into the office and they'll just kind of have their own separate little area where they won't really interact with people. That might be an accommodation, but it might not be. But you don't know until you kind of engage in that process. Where employers right now are getting nervous is where they basically say, in response to that accommodation, we don't care, you come back or you're fired. If they don't engage in that interactive process, that in and of itself is an issue. So the question is, find out why the employee is refusing to return to work. If they're scared of COVID, like many people are, completely legitimate, or if they don't want to leave the comfort of their own home, like many people, I imagine, that's not really protected, right? But if they have some sort of documented medical condition and advice of a medical provider, that's a different story. And those two types of responses from the employee as to here's why I won't come back to the office, they require different responses from the company.
So Damien, just to kind of summarize, the most important piece is that communication, right? There needs to be open dialogue between whether it's HR or the business owner with the employee team, so that everyone's aware of the reasoning behind certain decisions, and then the employees feel comfortable to come back, up the chain to say, listen, I'm not comfortable with this and here's why. And that's really one of the best ways to be able to mitigate your risk as a business owner in having any sort of lawsuit against you for making people come back when they didn't want to for XYZ reason. Is that fair?
Yeah. And that hits a larger theme that we always kind of advise our clients and people generally, which is there needs to be communication with employees. And this is awkward. For the first time, employers are being almost required to have conversations with their employees about personal beliefs, medical conditions, things like that I quite frankly don't even speak about with some of my friends and family. So now employers are expected to have those conversations with their employees. It's awkward. It's tricky. It can be done right. It can be done wrong. But the idea is to communicate and have that conversation with the employee and let them know that we're going to have questions. You need to kind of provide those answers to us. You're going to have questions. We'll need to provide answers about that to you. We'll do that in written policies. We'll do that in communications and conversations, but there needs to be a dialogue, 100%.
Great, thank you. So we are going to cover how vaccines interplay with this in just one second, but go ahead, Karen, you unmuted, so there must be a question.
Yeah, there is a question around asking about vaccination status. I know you're jumping into that, but there is another question as well. Do we need to be more heavy-handed with accommodation requests and stick to protected only, basically avoiding opening a Pandora's box with one? Not being a good person for a request that is not protected, so other staff won't flood you with accommodation requests.
I mean, to me, that's a legal question, so I'm gonna punt that over to Damien.
Fine, fair enough. It's a great question. The concern is the law requires, the law requires a certain level of dialogue for accommodation requests with certain employees. The problem is that it's a slippery slope, because suddenly you might find that a lot more employees than you expected have some sort of medical condition or have some sort of basis they believe for having an accommodation. So it is tricky. I think that, just taking off my lawyer hat for a second here, there are scenarios where, as a matter of law, there needs to be an interactive process, because this is a request for an accommodation. And remember, employers only need to provide a reasonable accommodation. They do not need to provide something that is just completely impossible or unduly burdensome for them to carry through in order to accommodate that employee. But taking off my lawyer hat for a second, you also have a lot of very angsty employees, just generally. Employees are nervous about COVID. They're nervous about returning to work. They've been at home now for a year or whatever it may be, and they're comfortable doing that. So it requires some level of humanity, which I know is kind of strange advice to hear from a lawyer, perhaps, but it is true. You do need to kind of get into, again, what is it about that person that they are requesting this accommodation? Is it they've got a couple of young kids and it's incredibly difficult? They kind of have their routine and it will really upend their routine. That may or may not be legally protected, but at least have that conversation to figure out what that is. That might be treated differently than somebody who said, I hate my commute, so I'd rather just stay home. Thanks though. So if you could just let me stay home for the next, indefinitely rather, that'd be greatly appreciated. It's a slippery slope. It's a case-by-case basis. I think any employer or advisor who says, here's the one right way of doing it, everything else is wrong, they're lying to you. There's no one right way to do this. It is a very fact-specific type of interaction that you have to have. Unfortunately, there's no kind of blanket rule in that scenario.
So it's interesting that we talk about how lenient should we be with accommodations, right? Because I think of protected classes and, in my knowledge of running a business, there are very specific definitions of protected classes, right? And so are we trying to stay within the confines of those definitions when we talk about making accommodations for return to work? And by way of your example, Damien, you have small children at home, you don't want to send them to daycare, that's not a protected class.
Yeah, and that's where the humanity comes in. You have to kind of figure out what, as a company, you're willing to accommodate, and then be mindful, because you will then have, if you accommodate, going off of that one example, if you accommodate that individual because they have one or two kids at home and childcare is difficult right now, you might find yourself facing some uproar from the people who work for you who don't have kids and think that, oh, just because I don't have kids, I'm now being punished. I have to return to work. If only I had kids, I would have this great excuse to work from home. And then that's where you kind of have what we talked about, about 15 minutes ago, this unintentional differential impact in terms of a policy that seems fair and good on its face, but suddenly it's now pitting parents versus non-parents in the workplace. This is exactly why these webinars are taking place all around the country, is because it's very difficult to navigate these issues. There's not one right way of doing it. There are a lot of wrong ways to do it, which is sometimes the best thing you could do is try to avoid those. But it requires some level, getting back to it, some level of kind of a human touch and figuring out what you as a company will require, what you will cave into, for lack of a better term, and allow, and where you'll draw the line, because the line needs to be drawn somewhere. I mean, I think that's clear for everybody.
Right. Jen, anything you want to add on this before we move into vaccines?
Yeah, I'll just, from my perspective, as far as the different organizations that we're in and out of, I'm a big fan of consistency from a policy and a practice point of view. So establishing a baseline for what is and is not going to be part of that consultative process is one thing. But on top of that, and perhaps even more critically, is the importance of really transparent, open, and honest communications, and communicate and over and over and over again. Because if you can get in front of the questions before it becomes an issue, you can solve it before it gets to the point where someone is formally requesting an accommodation. And having those dialogues with individuals and say, look, how do you feel? What are we doing? Damien's right. The whole humanity conversation, like, I never want to get in the middle of how someone manages their family, whether that's kids, and aging parents, someone with an increased risk. Like, whatever it is, I don't want them to feel that it is a choice between them earning a livelihood and taking care of their family, whatever that is. So let's try to figure it out.
Right.
And figure it out in a way that doesn't create some sort of, crazy precedent or potential liability issue for the business, because we also need to continue to run our businesses. But like, I cannot overstate the importance of communication through all of this.
Right. Okay. Well, let's throw up another poll question and kind of pivot the conversation to vaccines. So just from a sense of where the audience is, have you discussed vaccinations with your staff yet? I'm very curious about this one, so we'll leave it open a couple more seconds. All right, Brittany, if you want to publish, we're about 50-50 on this one. I think that's pretty interesting. 45% yes, 55% no, which is probably where I would have expected it to land. So very, very interesting. I'm going to open this up to both of you. Can business owners require vaccines? And listen, we've been told HIPAA, we've been told all kinds of things. Even in the beginning of COVID, we can't ask about underlying health conditions. We just have to believe it. So are we even allowed to ask our team members if they've been vaccinated? And should we require proof of that yes or no statement?
Jen, you want me to kick this one off?
I'm up to you. I can go.
Right.
You go.
Right. I'll try to dispel some myths that are out there. There's a lot of confusing information out there. I will only confuse it a little more. So let's give this a shot. As a general matter, yes, employers can mandate the vaccine for their employees. As a practical and legal matter, I do not think they should. I'll throw that out there. That could be debated, although I actually don't think that that's that controversial of a position. It's yes, you can. You probably shouldn't. And I'll explain that in a second. Can you ask if someone's vaccinated? Yes, you can. And in fact, if somebody says they are vaccinated, you can also ask them for proof by showing via the form of the vaccination card. That is all totally legitimate. There's federal and state guidance that allows that. It's not considered a HIPAA inquiry or anything like that. You still do want to keep that information confidential and not tell, Bob down the hallway that Sue didn't get her vaccine or she's only halfway through her, her 2-shot protocol or whatever it may be. You still want to maintain confidentiality, but you can ask, and you can ask for proof. The trick is that if the employee says, no, I have not been vaccinated, I think it's best practice to stop there. That's where the inquiry stops, because there are exceptions for mandatory vaccines. And one involves sincerely held religious beliefs, and the other involves underlying medical conditions. In Jersey, there's also a separate kind of related category for pregnant women. So if the employer says, no, I didn't get vaccinated, then that begs the question that the employer wants to know, which is, well, are you going to? And if not, why not? And then you find yourself having that conversation with your employee about their sincerely held religious beliefs. How religious are you? Do you really go to whatever it may be every Friday night, or you really observe this or that? Or do you have any proof of that? Is there anyone who could, support that? Or let me see your medical documentation. How bad is it? Are you sure you can't get the shot? Is it not advisable, or are you told no? Again, incredibly awkward conversations, difficult conversations to have. I think it's a really dangerous ground to be on. So that's why I think if an employee says, no, I have not been vaccinated, that probably stops the inquiry right there. Again, this requires some dialogue with your employees. How far you want to push it is entirely up to the employer. But I think best practices are to probably encourage and advise and suggest employees to get the vaccine as opposed to mandate it. And then, yes, I think it's actually good practice to ask what employees' plans are if they are going to get vaccinated. And if you find employees pushing back saying no, or they refuse, they prefer not to answer, stop there and tread carefully.
Jen, anything to add to that?
Yes, there's a lot to unpack here. So with the request, I think we always use the adage, if you ask the question, be ready for the answer with everything that we do. And when it comes to asking someone if they're vaccinated or plan to vaccinate or whatever, like, what are you going to do with the information? Like, why are we asking the question, and how is it influencing whatever plans or policies we're putting in place? And it comes up a lot with the clients we're working with, and some of them are opting to go ahead and ask the question, and some are deciding not to. And the logic behind it is, if asking the question allows us to have better information for the planning of return to work, then okay, but ask the question and stop there. If you're not able to do anything meaningful with the outcome of that question, and it's not changing the protocols or the procedures that you're putting in place as you reopen, I don't see the need in asking the question.
So here's an interesting perspective, looping this back to the first topic we talked about, which was returning to work. How does someone being vaccinated impact the discussion and the communication that you're going to have if they then come to you and say, well, I don't want to come back, right? Are they at a disadvantage if they've been vaccinated in that conversation, or are they are they better off not being vaccinated to make that case? I mean, where does that sort of interplay with employers requiring people to come back and that employee has been vaccinated?
So for me, those are two separate things. Someone saying they don't want to come back and either requesting accommodation or saying that they would prefer not to come back. And those, again, are two separate things. But for me, I would treat that completely separately from whether or not someone has chosen to vaccinate themselves based on their own independent health decisions. So they're two different things for me. And Damien may correct me if I'm wrong, but I treat those separately.
Yeah, no, I think that's the right way of looking at it. And I was kind of smirking, Sarah, as you said this, because I do know people who have been vaccinated and at this point are like, I really don't want to tell my manager, because if I do, I think they're going to tell me, come June 1 or July 1, you're back in the office full time, and I don't want to go back. So it's a very real, I'm only saying that because that is not a hypothetical question. I think that's a really, really real question, for lack of a better term. But, it's, again, I think you have to be very careful about, Jen brought up a great point, why you're kind of, when you get this information from your employees, what you are planning to do with it. One thing that concerns me is I do think that there are, whether we want to admit it or not, there are very serious divides about people who get the vaccine and don't. This is socioeconomic, demographic, religious, ethnicities, political beliefs for sure. So by saying we're going to ask employees to let us know if they've got the vaccine, and if they do, maybe we'll bring those people back first, because we'll then have an office of fully vaxxed people. You might find that your office looks very different with your fully vaxxed people in the office and the non-vaxxers at home, or whatever it may be. And non-vaxxers could be because of a legitimate medical excuse, or someone's pregnant, or I don't believe in that. I think there's a chip in it, or whatever it may be. You have to be very careful about what that looks like, because if that has some sort of disparate impact on what the workplace looks like in terms of the breakdown of who's in the office and who's not, then employers can find themselves in some trouble. This is exactly, unfortunately, I feel like some of these questions don't really have answers. They're just more so things to think about and be mindful about, because again, the guidance is constantly changing, but there's no one right way of handling this. But again, a lot of probably wrong ways of handling it.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think you can't even try to imagine every hypothetical situation that you're going to run into when you start making decisions like this. I know New Jersey is starting to open up more from a governmental standpoint with lifting some of the restrictions. New York as well came out recently and said, everything's going to open July 1 with the exceptions of Broadway and schools. But there's so much to try to get your arms around. Karen, you took yourself off mute. Do we have a question in the chat?
We do, and I'm hoping that these letters mean something to Jen, Damien, and you, Sarah. Is employee data about vaccine status considered PHI or is just PII? And what about HIPAA protections for storing it if it is considered PHI?
So PHI is protected health information. So it's all about what we're storing about people's health data. And with that, I'm going to let Damien sort of start first, and then I'll come in with the softer stuff.
Fair enough. I have to see whether it's considered actually qualified under HIPAA. I do know that there are confidentiality concerns, so I think it should be treated as qualifying under HIPAA protected in the sense of keeping it confidential. It is not in the sense where it is an intrusion into someone's privacy to ask them for this information. That's kind of what we talked about before. The federal guidance and state guidance for that matter is very clear. It is not an improper inquiry to ask someone if they have been vaccinated and if they say yes to get that vaccination card from them. But there are confidentiality requirements once you get that. You have to maintain that. I know some companies that say, okay, great, we'll put people's vaccination status in their personnel files. The problem with the personnel files, and again, this varies by company, is there could be a lot of eyes on someone's personnel file. You could have a 5-person, operations or HR team, and every single one of those people can open it up and say, "Oh, Bob is vaccinated, Sue isn't," or this is where whatever it may be. And so you have to be careful about that. So there are 100% confidentiality requirements once you have that information. And again, this ties perfectly back into what Jen was saying. Then you have to wonder whether it's worth asking, because if you ask, you will receive, and then you have a requirement now that you have that information in your hands.
And another question has come in around vaccines. What is your feedback on giving paid days off, not from employees sick or PTO balance, to employees who take the vaccine and get side effects, which was suggested by the president recently?
Oh, there's a terrific law on that. So Jen, Damien, I don't know which one you wants to talk about this, but I know it's all part of the FMLA and the sick paid that came out, I think, with the second CARES Act.
Go for it, Damien. You can start.
Yeah. So the FFCRA, which was passed, I think, almost a year ago at this point, and has been amended and updated and extended and all these things, way more complicated than we need to get into right now, but I'm happy to talk with anyone offline about it. It has extended the qualifying reasons where individuals might be eligible for paid time off again, this is a federal statute, and employers who offer this get a tax credit for it. Don't ask me how the tax credits work. That is way outside of my realm. I don't know, but I know that they get them.
I can answer that part later.
Yeah, I was gonna do a shameless plug there, but okay. But the answer is that the federal statute now allows for protected paid leave for individuals who are going to get vaccinated and need time off from work or who experience side effects from it. That's at a federal level. I don't believe Jersey has caught up with that. I know New York has now implemented a paid leave, I think up to 4 hours per shot for employees. So if anyone's got employees in New York, there is a separate state law there that allows for paid leave for employees to go and get the vaccine. Again, the federal statute deals with going to get the vaccine and also the side effects of it. And I think New York statute can probably be interpreted that way too.
Damien, is there a differential between businesses that may have under 50 employees or over 50 employees when it comes to this? Or is this anybody that is a business with employees?
Yeah, the latter essentially. I mean, there are size requirements for the FFCRA, but I think I think the FFCRA initially was the line was, I think, 500 employees. There is an exemption for companies with under 50 employees if they can show that complying with the statute would be an undue hardship. I could tell you we've had one client approach us to say, hey, can we get out of this? And that's a very difficult conversation to have, because I don't think companies will be able to get out of this, nor do I think they should, from probably more from Jen's perspective, because that sends an interesting message to your employees that, yeah, we realize we could provide these benefits to you and we get some tax credits for it, but too bad. So I think it will apply to most small businesses, yeah, or if not all. Yeah.
Jen, anything on the humanities side of this?
So I think that when people have, in New Jersey, what we're seeing for the most part with the small businesses is they're using the New Jersey earned sick leave, right? So if someone's getting vaccinated, if they're getting side effects, and, we're seeing, a fairly decent incident rate where people they feel like rubbish, right? For, a few hours or a couple of days, they're using their paid sick leave to recover from that. And for the most part, everyone we work with, they've been generous with that. They're like, look, take the time you need. Do what you got to do. We're happy to support you through that. And it's not we've already adjusted to the idea of earned sick leave for those organizations that had not had paid sick leave previously. So that's already, from a integration point of view, is already, we've crossed that hurdle, I guess, or crossed that bridge. I think, again, it comes down to, do as much as you can. Support your people. And, I know you can probably speak more intelligently to the payroll tax credit story. But there are mechanisms in place if people do get time off to recoup those salary costs. It takes a little time, and you can probably speak to that better than I can. But as far as being able to recover the lost, it basically comes down to a cash flow question, essentially. But there are mechanisms in place to recover some of the money.
Right. And I tend to agree with both of you. I think not necessarily a good morale decision if you're going to come out and say, yeah, we understand this is sort of a revenue neutral situation for us as a business owner, but we're not going to offer that to you. Sorry, you need to cash in a sick day or a PTO day or what have you. So let's go back to, all right, now we're sort of opening. We have some people who are vaccinated, some people who aren't vaccinated, and we're kind of all in this melting pot together, right? And as I've always said from the beginning of this, there's just no real good guidance from any one source. So where do we sit now with still requiring temperature checks, still requiring the questionnaires that we've all been used to for the last year? And where do we sit coming back to the office with and without vaccines, with people wearing masks? Again, I know the CDC and our state is not always in sync. So what do you guys recommend on this? And Jen, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Sure. It's a fun one. So there's a lot of variability, right? And what we're seeing from a questionnaire point of view is that we've got some organizations that are still interested in using questionnaires because they feel that it provides them with input on where people stand. Have they been out of state, for example, getting them to certify if they've been out of state and say, okay, yes, I've gotten my test to show that I'm negative, whatever it is. I will say that those organizations that are looking at maintaining questionnaires and what I would call a more structured protocol, highly recommend using professional software to do that. And there are some products that have hit the market, largely coming out of COVID, that do that and do it in a way that is HIPAA compliant. Regarding what the behaviors and the protocols are in the workplace, masks versus no masks, how you navigate through the office environment, et cetera, I believe that whatever we do, and particularly when it comes to who's in a conference room and how they're in a conference room, do it the same for everybody. So if you're not sure, let's, for the sake of argument, not everyone's going to be 100% vaccinated. If people are in a conference room, maintain the appropriate social distancing protocol and ask people to wear a mask. And whatever you do, do it for everybody. And I know that there's been a lot of conversation about, yes, well, if everyone's vaccinated, the CDC says we can take off our masks. That is true. But then it comes back to the original question of, are we asking people if they're vaccinated? Do we know if that is in fact the case? Because we're only getting attestations, not validation. And, you know, again, ask the question, be ready for the answer. Are we creating a situation where we are differentiating parts of the population in a way that is perhaps, at best case, damaging to morale, worst case, considered discriminatory?
Damien, thoughts on this?
That's perfectly said, Jen. You know, especially the last component about, I'm just now envisioning in my head kind of having a typical like corporate office floor where there's like the people who are fully vaxxed are over there, and then the people who aren't are over here, and like it's like, you know, the Titanic where you've got like different levels of people and, you know, different classes and treated differently. It just doesn't sound like what the American workplace should sound like, or any workplace for that matter. But you know, it just getting back to the main question a little bit before I go on too much of a tangent. The CDC guidance is always changing. I think it just changed this past week to kind of update about this idea that people who are fully vaxxed do not need to, as long as they're together, even if they're indoors, do not need to have a mask. I think it's still good practice. Again, there's a bit of, this isn't so much legal approach, but just kind of optics approach. I think it's still a good idea if you're going to have a group of people in a closed environment in the office, to have them wear masks and social distance. A lot of this is optics. A lot of this is keeping employees safe, but also showing to employees, we take this seriously. And, you know, we don't care if you're all vaxxed and you all see each other on the weekends anyway and hang out. If you're in the office, we're going to have you follow the guidance that it is what it is. Again, as Jen said, it also begs the question that assumes that you know everyone's vaccination status, which we've already talked about at length, but that's a tricky path to navigate. In terms of the temperature checks and the questionnaires, I agree with Jen as well. There are some great systems out there to kind of make this as simple as possible. There's still guidance on this to perform those types of activities. I also think, again, this is an easy lift for employers to show that they take this seriously. Do this for everyone. Even if you know that so-and-so is vaccinated, still have them fill out the questionnaire and do their temperature check and all that stuff. And just one quick tidbit on that, a place that we are seeing companies trip up on this is if you have hourly employees who are entitled to overtime and who are paid hourly, the time spent going to and from and dealing with these types of screening protocols is technically time that they need to be compensated for. So if you have a policy where only one person in an elevator to bring them up to the office on the 10th floor, so-and-so has to wait an extra 20 minutes every single day, both, you know, to go up and to go down, they're technically on the clock. And I think a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys are digging into this and trying to see if there's some easy wage and hour violations that they can go after. So just I know I'm not supposed to say this, but some free legal advice there.
Great, guys. Thanks so much. So let's talk a little bit about, now, I envision and have witnessed sort of this us versus them mentality, right? Not only between people who are vaccinated and not vaccinated, but also between people who choose to come to the office and people who choose not to for whatever reasons. And so, Jen, this talks to kind of behaviors of people and, really nothing that as business owners we've ever had to deal with issues that are so polarizing, to our employee population. And so, from an HR perspective, our team members are dealing with anxiety, disengagement, fear. I mean, let's ignore the exhaustion of just trying to figure out how to separate work from home, which we've all been still battling for 14 months. But I mean, what advice do you have in dealing with all of these new polarizing feelings that the pandemic has brought up?
So this is the $64,000 question, right? So I don't think in all of the time that I've worked in this field, I have seen something that has created so much turbulence in workplace behaviors and honestly in our just our lives, right? What I think is the following. The first is being upfront and open and transparent as possible in communication I think that as we begin to bring people back into the workplace, acknowledging that even for those of us who are really excited to get back to the office and see our colleagues, there is going to be a certain level of maybe not anxiety, but discomfort in the early days because we don't know what to do. Do we shake hands? Do we hug? Do we walk? Do we there's all this stuff none of us have done for 14 months. I was at an event earlier this week. No one knew if they should shake hands or not. We don't know how to do that anymore. So there's all of this that needs to be a little bit mainstreamed and have this open conversation about, all right, how are we all going to work together? Then as we start to cross into some of the polarizing topics of what comes into the workforce and what doesn't, I think there is some value to, being upfront with people and saying, look, we're going to bring people into the office. This is what we're doing or not doing around asking questions. This is what we're doing and not doing about making people feel safe. It is important for us to bring people back in a way that they can work effectively and efficiently and continue to, run the business, grow the business and everything that we're doing. And this is what we're doing to make sure that everyone is okay. And that's a really important conversation to have. So this is what we're doing to make sure everyone's okay. And this is what we're expecting all of you to do as part of that solution. And I think if we can create common solutions where employees feel that they are part of that change and they own part of it, then it dispels some of the us versus them. And, the us versus them is, employer, employee. It's, people who are vaccinated versus not vaccinated, managers versus individual contributors. There's so many different dynamics to that. But if we all agree that we want to come back into the office so that we can work together because we're all working toward a common goal in this business, this is how we're going to do it in a way that everyone can still be okay. And bringing people along for the ride is a really important behavioral component. The other thing that I was saying sort of early in the pandemic was I sincerely hope that coming out of this, we can start to mainstream the conversation around mental health, because never before in my career have I seen so many issues around mental health concerns. And the idea that it is something that we need to address as employers. It is something that we need to address as HR professionals. It's something from even a group healthcare benefits perspective, as far as what is covered and not covered. It is flipped the table on that whole dialogue. And, if anything good comes out of this, then I hope it's that. And with that, I will let Damien weigh in on his end.
I mean, and that's a valid point, Jen. I joke that, they didn't prepare me for all of the things about running a business when I went to accounting school. And, certainly they didn't equip me to handle these mental health issues and all of these polarizing issues. And I'm sure many, many business owners on this call who don't have, a full HR corporate department, we're, trying to keep our heads above water. And it's very draining and frustrating. And we all have good intentions. We just want to keep everything moving forward. And it's just such a challenge. I do want to throw up one final poll question. And this is more skewed on the legal risk management side. So have you or your company already addressed the risk and exposure with potentially reopening? So our options are: you have not addressed, you're in the process of addressing, which kind of feels like it's a continual thing. Or yes, I understand our current insurance coverage, policies, and procedures. And this is a really interesting point because we're bringing in not only the legal side, but we're going to talk a little bit, Damien, about, I know, insurance in this next piece. So in the interest of time, Brittany, why don't you publish those results so everyone can see? And then Damien, I'm going to pose this to you from a legal perspective. What are the greatest risks that business owners face with these returning to work options, and how does insurance play into some of these risk mitigation strategies?
Yeah, I'll start with the insurance part first, because I think that's quicker, or hopefully quicker. So I think, the idea here is business owners, they need to be up to date on their policies. They need to kind of know what their coverage is, what their liabilities are. That's from the numbers side. With insurance, I think conversations with insurance professionals to kind of go through all the different scenarios of what types of risks there might be, what type of employee concern might create an insurable event or whatever it may be. I think speaking with an attorney or somebody, and obviously that's a bit selfish, but speaking with somebody who has seen how these issues have bubbled up, that can give you kind of hypothetical scenarios that person can run by their carrier and say, here's hypotheticals A, B, C, D, and E. Tell me how my coverage is on this and what, if anything, needs to change. I think that's a smart conversation to have. In terms of just the greatest risk to business owners with returning to office, I know I've said this before, not having clear policies in place, not communicating with employees. And I like Jen's point, which I wasn't even really thinking about, but trying to kind of involve the employees in shaping those policies. This doesn't have to be an employer mandate and you fall into line or you don't. This can be kind of a back and forth to figure out what works best. And that might be easier for the 4-person company than for the 5,000 person company. But it is what it is. But if there's kind of one tidbit that I hope people also take away from this, from the legal perspective, it's that anxious employees generally are more of a legal liability. Employees who don't know what their company is doing, employees who have inconsistent communications from their employers, who don't feel cared for, who don't feel like there's something in place to make this return to work go smoothly, they're more of a legal liability. That's just the way it is. There's 100% the human side of it, and it's probably not the right thing to do to keep them in the dark. But if you're looking at it purely from a risk perspective, one of the first questions we ask is, what have you communicated to your employees so far? What do they think or know that you are doing, not doing? Do they know what your plans are? Is it everyone back in June, or is it we're going to make a decision after January 1st? And if the answer is they don't really know anything because we haven't really communicated, that's a problem. Because if employees don't know what is being done, they're going to assume the worst, which is nothing's being done. There's no plan. It's all up in the air, and they don't have anything in place to kind of bring us back and keep us safe when they do bring us back. That's a really big issue. And then that just from a more practical perspective, very quickly, not responding to employee complaints or concerns the right way is going to be a big risk. There are going to be a lot of employees who say, I'm uncomfortable with this. I don't want to do this, whether it's I don't want to come to work or I'm going to come to work, but I heard so-and-so isn't vaccinated. So keep them away from me. And I don't want to see them in the bathroom or whatever it may be. Companies will have to actually respond to these questions. And again, there are some right ways to do it and a lot of really wrong ways to do it. And I think that's something else that we'll see kind of play out. There will be a lot of litigation over that, I think. And it's already started. We've actually seen some where companies just aren't responding to those employee concerns appropriately. That's the big risk.
Great. Well, we are coming up on the top of the hour, so I'm going to open it up to any final questions from the audience. And Karen, did we miss any questions that came through on the chat that we didn't get to work in?
We did, with just one, and maybe you can run through this quickly. JP Morgan announced on Tuesday that all US-based employees are expected back to the office on a rotating basis by July. Do you think this will set a precedent?
If I could jump in real quick, I love this question and I hate this question. And here's why. Full disclosure, my wife works for JP Morgan, so she received this communication. And we were dealing with this, we were talking about this last night at dinner. It's a very real concern. We have a 1.5-year-old and we've gotten accustomed to our life working from home and our routine and our schedule. We're concerned about what that looks like. That is exactly, it kind of came out of nowhere from her perspective. And again, that probably wasn't handled the best way. But putting that aside, will it set a precedent? I think so. I think JP Morgan has kind of a history of trying to be a leader in their industry with things like this. So I do think when you see the big companies bringing people back, it suddenly becomes a lot easier or comfortable for small business owners to say, I guess it's probably our turn too. And I think if you couple that with the New York City reopening and Jersey talking about really reopening a lot of businesses, again, these aren't hypothetical types of scenarios. This is real. I think, it's going to look very different in the next few months. And JP Morgan probably is trying to set the lead on that.
Great. Well, on that note, Jen, I want to turn it over to you from a SHRM credit standpoint for anybody on the call who's looking to get credit. I know we have the code that's needed.
Yep. So anyone who wants to get credit for their SHRM continuing ed can check the chat. The code is in there. Otherwise, you're welcome to reach out to me afterwards and we'll get it over. Yeah.
Great. Well, Jen, Damien, thank you so much for joining us this hour. I mean, I feel like we could have made this an 8-hour seminar and still not covered everything. So I'm sure that there will be more office hours on this and related topics, and guidance, as Damien said earlier, is ever changing. So again, thank you so much for helping us unpack this. To the audience, if there's other topics that you want us to cover on future office hours, please feel free to reach out to Karen and Brittany so that we can get those on the schedule. We will be sending you a follow-up email after this today. And again, if you want to share this recording with anyone who wasn't able to join, it will be up on our website shortly. So I wish everybody a happy, healthy Friday and a great weekend, and thanks for joining us.